Now I'm privileged to turn over our conversation to Dr. David Smith to kick us off. And a round of applause first.
Thank you, Chloe. And Lisa, I feel like we needed to just kind of stay there in that order, do a little exposure therapy with you around. It's okay to have a little bit of disorder. It's okay. Well, good morning, and thanks so much. I'd like everybody to give another round of applause to Lisa and her team for this incredible setup here, bro. Thank you. And really amazing to see the people in the room here today. I was talking to my colleague, Kate Mangino, a little earlier about, as we were looking around the room, it's like, how many people do you know? I was like, actually, for the networks that we're all in, is like, I don't know as many people, and that's exciting. So I hope to get to learn a little bit more about all the work that you're doing and hear from all the panelists today. Lisa and I have worked together for a while, and we're co-authors, proud to say. And when she asked me to do this panel, I was so excited to focus on this topic specifically around relational equity and belonging in the workplace. So I think you're in for a great conversation. I've been working, and as I've gotten to know some of my colleagues up here on the panel today, and Tina Opie up there, I'm fangirling, Tina. This is me fangirling with you right now. And sorry you're not here in person, but we'll make that happen next time. So excited to have this conversation today, because I think this is a really important one that we've been struggling with, and in terms of how do we create these spaces and cultures in our workplaces that really do thrive on inclusion, and we do it in a way that drives both inclusion and performance within our organizations. And I think that's not an either or, it has to be a both and so today I hope that we will take that away from these experts up here who've been doing research and thinking very deeply about these topics in the work that they're doing. And so excited to have this amazing group of panelists to work with here today. So let's get started, and let's jump into, I want to pose a question that we talked about for the entire panel, for everyone here to give their perspective on, to really get us kicked off on the bigger picture around relational equity, and thinking about how do we define, let's start with what does good look like, and what does success look like in prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion and relational initiatives in our workplace, and thinking about really how do those begin to drive belonging and culture out there. And as part of that, I would love to think about, what are the metrics, or what drives that approach for you that you're thinking about, especially, and this was really in our prep call, we spent a lot of time thinking about this in the particular current environment that we're in, this political, social climate that we're in right now that has made it even more challenging. So I'd love to hear more about, again, how do you define success, and what are you looking for, the metrics that are guiding that success? So Crystal, can we start with you?
Of course. So I think success when it comes to belonging is being able to create an environment where people can show up to work as their full and authentic selves. And when we're able to do that, what we're really doing is taking away that hidden tax, that cognitive and emotional labor that comes with having to maybe prepare for a day of masking, or prepare to, or fear backlash, where we have to contort ourselves into these narrow definitions of what leadership looks like. So really, when organizations are focusing on belonging, what they're really doing is focusing on taking away that hidden cost. So where that energy is now being placed into the work itself and not being expended. And that's where we get to exhaustion and burnout and things of that sort.
Test? Okay. I think I have a very similar answer to Crystal, where for me, success looks like a world where everyone, regardless of who they are, is accepted for who they are, and we sort of value the different ways of doing things. So in a world where we have people who not only are different from us, but might be doing things that are different from us, and we recognize that not only is that okay, that's better. And I think with this kind of work, we love to focus on metrics and representation and things that you can measure, and now we can't even measure those things. And I think it's harder to think about feelings, like, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I'm supported? We can measure those things too. But I think thinking about it this way in a world where everyone is thriving really sort of avoids this debate of should we do this or not? Because in my world where everyone is thriving, it's good for everyone. Our businesses are more innovative. We have more creative ideas for processes. Our relationships with our colleagues are richer and deeper. We have more information about the people we work with. We feel more complete. We feel less stressed. We feel happier. So I think that's what success looks like to me.
Hi, everyone. So I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, and I'm really honored to be on this panel, in part because it allows me to see things from a different light. But when I started doing this work, I'm a social network analyst, and so I study relational analytics. And from that perspective, I look at how people are connected and the constellations of the ways that people communicate, collaborate, build trust in organizations. And I didn't start with the lens of gender or religion or ethnic background. But when you start to unpack those networks, when you start to derive some of these networks, these metrics from the network data that we can gather, it's not surprising that we would see some of these fractions occurring in the networks. And so typically from an organizational perspective, we think about 3 different networks. We think about the decision-making network, the idea network, and the emotional support network. And if we allow people in organizations to develop workplace relationships just kind of organically, then they're going to form relationships with people who are similar to them. It's not surprising, right? We're drawn to people who share our values, who share our backgrounds. And we see that happening in decision-making networks. We see a lot of different cliques and factions occurring between men and women in decision-making networks. So that's not necessarily surprising. We actually uncover those in idea networks as well. In emotional support networks is where we see the biggest differences, where women are supporting more women, men are supporting more men. And so how can we design kind of policies and practices that help to rewire some of those networks? How can we create some more of this inclusion where we're not forcing or reorchestrating these relationships, but we're allowing them to form in a way that isn't just grouped based on similarity? And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm taking on this.
And Tina?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So very honored to be on the panel. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. So I think about this question in terms of levels of analysis. We had a very good conversation on our prep call about how as positive as belonging can be, it is often sort of constrained to the individual level where organizations will say, well, people have a sense of belonging. That's at the individual level. So that individual may have positive emotions, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to the individual level, I think it's important to consider the interpersonal as well as institutional levels of analysis. And what do I mean by that? So interpersonal, the relational things that some of my co-panelists have already talked about, but how diverse are their networks? What is the flow of information that is happening? Because we know from other research that in certain networks, some information is redundant, it's the exact same. Those individuals are not being informed about the promotion opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's critical to consider the interpersonal and sort of network level as well. And then finally, the institutional level. So we don't often think about belonging at an institutional level, but what we can think about is equity. So pay equity, promotion, recruiting practices, feedback mechanisms. So in addition to belonging, I think it's critical that we think about those levels of analysis because it actually may cause us to look at things a little bit differently than belonging. And one of the things that I like to bring up, and again, not to pick on the term belonging, but I do think it's important and imperative that we critique it because I can be invited to lunches. People can have me to their homes. I can feel that I really belong. And yet I can be completely being paid inequitably, being treated differently than others in a negative way. And so I just want to make sure that we keep our eye on things such as equity and inclusion and diversity in addition to belonging.
Wow. I think one of the things I took away from that, Tina, is that as we think about it, as I start thinking about those levels of analysis, is that we are going to measure different things and we're going to be looking for different things along the way there. And so hopefully we'll come back to that with a question here a little bit later. Part of the challenge here that we've identified in all of these different levels, though, is around thinking about how organizations and more specifically about how leaders think about this, and how there's this really inherent tension between what does competition or healthy competition look like in as it compares to in the same world of talking about collaboration and trust and fairness. And so how do we begin to think about that? And Crystal, would love to hear your thoughts on this. How leaders can begin to build cultures that truly value and build structures around including both high performance and belonging in the organization.
Well, I'd first like to remind leaders that competition and collaboration are not at odds with each other. They're not opposites. But I think this idea comes from these two prevailing stereotypes that we have specifically about how women work together in the workplace. And so we have two simultaneous stereotypes going on. The first one is that women are not competitive, or they're just not as competitive as men. And then simultaneously, we have this idea that when women come together and they're working, well, this creates some tension. They see each other as competition and threats, and gossip ensues, and there's cattiness in the workplace. This recently got a lot of traction in the New York Times. And both of these are very oversimplified and untrue in representing what it is that women are, what it entails when they work together. It's very simplified, and it's not taking in the environment itself. Because when we step away from environments that are resource scarce or zero-sum models, we see that women actually collaborate incredibly well, and they are very valuable, powerful tools to one another, where they're able to build these friendships that are giving them more access to visibility, mentorship, and higher prestigious positions. So in order to understand where these narratives are coming from, we have to understand how friendships and relationships are formed. Historically, men have formed friendships based off of shared achievements, shared activities, and they're pretty comfortable with hierarchy. But women, we value things such as support, equality, and reciprocity in our relationships. And these oftentimes clash with these zero-sum resource scarce models that take over many workplaces. And so this also explains some of that competition gap. When women are competing in these models, they tend to downplay themselves, and it's most likely because they are anticipating some form of backlash or ridicule that they might face in outwardly showing their ambitions or their competitiveness. But the moment that that competition is reframed collaboratively or with those values, women are just as competitive as men in private contexts, on behalf of a team or someone they care about, pro-socially. So that competitive gap isn't actually quite there. So really, the solution to balancing the two is moving away from resource scarcity and zero-sum models.
Yeah, one of the things that resonated there with me is I often think back to like the earlier research that was done like on the Queen Bee syndrome. And it begins to tell the situation or the context, the culture really makes a difference in how that's perceived or experienced.
Yes, that's exactly it. That is where those notions come from, queen bee versus worker bee.
So let's take a little different tact on that and think about, though, there's also the tension there that somehow if we create this cooperation and trust and belonging in the organization, that somehow that's not aligned with creating performance and results in the organization. And so how can we work with leaders to help them see and to create cultures and structures within the organization that actually help to show that belonging enhances or advances culture and trust?
Well, that's exactly it, David. The research does show that having peer networks, having close friendships in the workplace is performance infrastructure. Employees who have close friends report being more satisfied and committed to their careers. They are more likely to collaborate, they are better at problem solving, and they want to stay in the roles or grow in the careers that they're in. In fact, we see that with women, I just mentioned that they are able to gain higher status positions with friends when they have these close friendships compared to those who don't. But there is a bit of a catch to this. So no, it's not a distraction, these friendships, but they do take work to maintain. And that is what we call relational labor or social glue work. So it's like smoothing over conflicts or trying not to rock the boat, or just maybe even remembering little details like someone's birthday, making sure there's a card in the office. All of these things impact our relationships, but they are disproportionately falling on women. They are taking the majority of this relational labor. And so this creates somewhat of a hidden tax because it's typically not measured, it's not recognized, so it's not rewarded. And so women who are taking on this extra load are actually reporting higher stress levels compared to their colleagues. So really, if leaders were to name these skills and recognize them as not against performance, but what actually sustains it, it would actually become a shared performance strategy.
Right. Let's shift gears just a little bit here and into a topic that's near and dear to my heart around allyship. And we're fortunate to have Olivia here today who does research in this area. And Olivia, I think that as I hear this whole conversation and how Jessica's been talking about this, that to me there seems like there are some really integral roles here where allyship could play, and thinking about what are those roles. How can leaders and organizations kind of foster that and use allyship to their advantage to create this kind of belonging? But there's also at the same time, there's some barriers that we should acknowledge. And then how do we overcome some of those barriers?
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited to be up here with you, David, as one of the foremost allyship scholars. Allyship, the research has shown that there is a need for allyship from dominant group members in the workplace. Research has shown time and time again that marginalized group members like women are not, it is not enough to have them be the ones solving their own inequity. This is because of something called the bias expertise trade-off. So often women in these women, when they're advocating for women's issues, are often seen as more biased. They have more self-interest, but also more expert. They really know these issues and they have more legitimacy. But unfortunately, this perception of bias gets in the way of them being effective. So when women are advocating for women's programs, people think it's out of self-interest. And so this raises the great opportunity for men to take on this burden. That being said, this bias expertise trade-off is also a barrier. A lot of times men feel that they lack legitimacy to bring up these issues. So this is something called psychological standing. A lot of men don't feel like it's their place to speak up on behalf of women's issues, that it's not their job. And so I think making it clear that it is men's job, that they have a role in this, is really helpful of overcoming these internal barriers. We also know that things like really high levels of emotional activation, really high levels of guilt, really high levels of shame can also be a barrier that can be distracting or paralyzing. And things like feeling inauthentic is another internal barrier. But as we talk about these internal barriers, I think it's also important to recognize external barriers. A lot of my work draws on theories of tempered radicals, which talks about how people within an organization try to make change given the constraints that they have. And within an organization, people are constrained. You're constrained by your priorities, by your bosses, by your coworkers. There are trade-offs that have to be made. And I think this work shows that there are ways to work through these external constraints as well. But it's important to recognize that there's a lot of pressure coming that says this is not something you should be doing. This is not worth your time. This is not your place.
Always been a fan of the term tempered radicals. I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh yeah.
It just strikes a chord with me every time I hear it. We need more of those in our lives and in our workplaces. So one of the other inherent tensions we see in the workplace, though, with allyship, and certainly one that has been written about and talked about even in pop press as well, is how we show up, and how we show up as what the term allies is really about, and not in terms of centering ourselves and not placing additional burden or invisible labor upon those we're trying to advocate for and create our allyship with. So how do we do that well, or how do we avoid those pitfalls?
It's a really important question, and my answer, although all of my answers here are with the goal of ultimately uncentering the ally. With that in mind, I'm now going to center the ally and say the first step is a lot of really important self-work. And I think allyship does involve looking into yourself, understanding your reactions to the world, understanding that people may see the world differently than you, that people have different perspectives, that people may interpret things differently than you. And I think just trying to do the work to understand and diversify as much as possible. You know, this is not something I've done research on, but I actually would really recommend allyship trying to like read as diversely as possible, read stories, read books from as many different perspectives as possible, because there are so many resources out there that prevents you from having to go to the one person in your life who is X category and say, you know, what's it like to be a trans person? Or, you know, there are lots of trans stories out there. So do that work first. Do your own work first. And then once you do that work, recognize that allyship is not like a one-time moment. It is a process. And there are going to be moments where you are going to need to do different actions. And so I think recognizing that showing up authentically means in every situation saying, do I want to show up here and how? There are ways, and also thinking about where you might thrive and what the situation requires. I think there are some people who might really thrive supporting and lifting up members of marginalized groups. Other people really love like talking to people who don't agree with these issues and trying to like get them on board. And so I think there is a space for people to sort into categories that really work for them. Ultimately, it goes back to what I said about everyone finding a place where they are able to thrive. It applies to allyship as well.
Great. And Jessica, I would like to think about this a little bit from a network's perspective and your area of expertise, and thinking about this invisible labor around relationship work, and how can we, again, a lot of that does often fall on women and other minority groups in the workplace out there. But how can we recognize that and begin to reward it effectively? And I think that's one of the challenges that we see in the workplace.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And again, it's one that I didn't necessarily start out examining, but something that kind of showed up unintentionally in the research that I was doing. One of the really fascinating things about relational analytics is when we think about the structure of organizations, we think about the formal organizational chart, and we think about the prescriptions for the way people are supposed to be going about doing their work, who they're formally assigned to work with, report to, et cetera. And so we see the solid lines in the organizational chart. But we also know that that's not the way that work really gets done in organizations, right? So people bridge those functional areas and divisions to create friendships, build trust, gossip, get background information, and have backstage conversations. And so through this idea of relational analytics in kind of gathering data on these informal networks and organizations, we're able to really get an X-ray into the way that work is getting done in organizations. And what this research shows is that about 70% of value-adding work happens through these informal networks. So they're essentially happening despite the formal organizational chart. We're skirting the organizational chart because we know who actually has the expertise. We know who actually is going to be willing to support us and who's going to be available. And the people who tend to be willing to be available are the people who take on that collaborative load, which also tends to be women. And so we're doing a lot of this, what we call relational labor, that takes the kind of connective work, the emotional work, that, you know, requires things, as Crystal was saying, kind of checking in with people, the things that help teams function effectively in the background. But these are often invisible. These are often unrewarded. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is thinking about how we can move beyond how formal HR policies and practices, because they have a critical role in shaping the architecture of these workplace relationships and these formal networks in organizations. How can we take those and use those to the advantage of the people that we're trying to acknowledge? So if we think that relational work, which we should, is valuable in organizations, we need to be able to quantify it. We need to be able to acknowledge it and recognize it. And so we've been advocating for organizations to include things like this in their formal performance evaluations. Who helped you connect to someone else during the last few months? Who reached out? Who engaged in some of this relational work? And actually value that, incorporate it into some of the promotional strategies that you're using. And this will incentivize that behavior and also recognize and reward it as well. Because right now it's just falling under the radar. And that is what leads us to, which I may talk about later, what we call collaborative overload. So these tend to be the people who are very central in these informal trust networks, collaborative networks. And so a lot of the effort and the load is falling on these really central individuals. And we tend to think of those people as pretty powerful. They're holding a lot of the power. A lot of people are coming to them for information and advice. But what's actually happening is they're getting incredibly overloaded by the effort and the work that they have to do. So this term collaborative overload has been really helpful in understanding why those key players actually end up leaving the organization. They start to become disengaged. They start to become burned out. A lot of those efforts aren't being measured, magnified, rewarded, and so they tend to leave to go look for other opportunities. Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, sure, sorry.
It's really, really interesting. And I've seen that, you know, I think myself within different organizations, that collaborative overload. But to some extent, I think there's a lot of value, obviously, that comes out of that. And are there specific examples, though, you've seen around how organizations have found ways to value that and to reward it without putting them into that overload situation?
This is something that I think is honestly relatively new. It's new in the networks literature in particular. We have a history of literature over the past few decades acknowledging descriptively that women's and men's networks look different in organizations. The work that started being done, a lot of this work, if you're interested, has been done by Rob Cross at Babson. And he's uncovering both the gender differences, right? Go Babson. He's uncovering a lot of these gender differences that are occurring. And this has been spreading through other scholars as well who are really interested in taking on this work. It shows that women scout for jobs differently. So the way that they find opportunities for jobs happens really differently. But a lot of HR departments are very wary of taking on this challenge because it means identifying people in a way that could set them up for things like lawsuits. And so I do think that there is a challenge where how do we do these things where it's not particularly aimed at one set of individuals? And so I think it's created a barrier to actually see any movement. What we've, again, been advocating for is let's not take who we want to be focused on, but the behaviors we want to be focused on. So let's centralize the performance evaluation around that behavior, and how do we incorporate the evaluation of that behavior into something that we can acknowledge, and then we'd be able to uncover that, in fact, it is a particular group of people that's taking on this load. I've actually seen the opposite, which is we've been making it worse. So not to discourage anything, but for example, I feel this at Rutgers actually relatively often, where they're telling us they want us to engage in community sponsored engagement. So they want us to do research that is impactful to policy in the community, but we don't have a very good way to measure that. It doesn't help with our promotions. And so they're kind of encouraging us to engage in this kind of work, which falls on certain populations of people who are doing the work that can have that impact. But there's actually no way that that's integrated into our performance evaluations or our promotion opportunities. And so I think those tend to be the things that we see occurring in organizations, is that we don't quite have a good way to do this. They've gotten to the point of saying they care, but not necessarily figuring out the way to reward it. And so I think this is something that we continually need to think about and to work on from a formal HR policy standpoint, because that's where we can make the change.
One quick follow-up there. It just struck me, it's like, this sounds a lot like office housework.
Yeah.
Right. And but in the broader sense, from a research perspective, now it's like, so now we're gonna ask you to do these things that we need to be done. Right. This is all work that needs to be done, which is typical of office housework, but it's not valued in the same way. Right.
Well, that's right. And I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is this is all data driven, right? So this is coming from the data, what's being uncovered by the data, and all of what I think we should be advocating for are data-driven solutions. And so it's not, again, leaning on is this bias, is this self-serving, is this something that we just feel is happening? It's not that it's just logical or biased, it's that this is what's being uncovered from the data, is that these are the groups of people that are being overloaded by this kind of work. And so descriptively, we're able to see it. Prescriptively, we haven't made enough movement in how to solve this problem. And so I think we need to shift when we're thinking about relational analytics and the way that we can use this kind of data rather than simply uncovering it. How can we use that as a prescription to drive some of that change? And we might need to test out some of these options that come into maybe just kind of light performance evaluation, kind of daily kind of acknowledgement that people are engaging in these things, asking who's been central in making some of those behavioral connections. And I do think that that will help to elevate how important organizations see this. What we might find is that organizations don't value it or don't think it's important, and that might tell us something about the climate and the culture as well.
Want me to change something I've been doing this way forever and ever and ever? Yeah. Olivia, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yep. Reminding for online people.
To put it closer to.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, great. While we're on this topic of talking more from a systemic perspective and different kinds of systems within the organization, I want to draw in Tina here and her expertise because I think this is really important. We had so many great conversations leading up to the panel on looking at this from the organizational level more broadly. And so Tina, as we were talking about measurement and really how do we begin to hold the organization, so our senior leaders, our leadership accountable in doing this work. How do we monitor this? How do we, so that we can hold them accountable in doing the work around these types of relational programs? And we talked about a variety of them, everything from mentorship programs to sponsorship programs, allyship programs. Every organization has some of these to some extent in their organization out there. But how do we hold them accountable and how do we measure that in a way, provide that visibility so that we can really see how it's working in terms of what it's supposed to be doing, and that's creating this relational equity?
Thank you so much for the question, David. And listen, what I'm about to say may be considered controversial because of the times in which we are living. But as Cuba Gooding Jr. said, show me the money. And what I think is really critical for organizations is to look at things like pay equity by race, by gender, by tenure, by division. And that is something that would, I don't know, it's not illegal, but I know people and many organizational leaders who might be in the room now may be afraid to do that because of concerns about litigation. But if we are going to be honest about our organizations, we know that there are pay inequities. And it's more comfortable right now to talk about gender, even though even that word has been banned in some places. But let's not forget about things like racism. That is critical to remember. And so, one of the things that I encourage organizations to do is to look at the information. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to release it to everyone in the organization, but for key decision makers, how do you look? What does it look like? How do you explain any disparities that you see? And if we believe that people are created equal and are given equal opportunity, then why are we seeing these disparate outcomes? So I hope I don't sound like Debbie Downer, but I think it's really important that we take a sober look at ourselves. I also want to go back to something, when you talk about the terms ally, there's a former student of mine is actually in the audience, which is so online. And she will know what I'm about to say. I want to give credit to Dr. Tiffany Jana, Jana, as well as Doctors Stella and Coma and Dr. Ella Bell. And they've all done some really good work in differentiating between allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators. And so the term ally, is this okay that I'm going down this path?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So the way that they differentiate this term is sort of, remember when Black Lives Matter was happening and there were so many books that were flying off the shelves of bookstores? Allies were the people who were running out to buy those books and they were marking up the margins and highlighting those books and then closing the book and going to work. That is how we have sort of come to understand allies. You believe in the idea of equity in practice. An accomplice is someone who believes in the idea of equity and is willing to act, but they're often based on their own ideas of what needs to happen. So the example I like to give is if a man comes, he's like, you know what, you all are being underpaid as women. Women strike. Women are like, wait a minute, hold on. That's not quite what we had in mind. But no, when I'm in places and spaces where you aren't, that's what I'm going to push for. But doctors Nkomo, Bell, and Jana talk about co-conspirators. And these are people who believe in the construct of equity, who act upon it, but their actions are led by the members of the historically marginalized groups that they're ostensibly helping. So they will actually do what some of my colleagues have mentioned. They'll read, they'll learn about some of the challenges that are confronting people from different historically marginalized groups. Hopefully, they will try to bridge, they will develop relationships based on trust, empathy, risk taking, and vulnerability. And they'll then take that risk. And so when they're in places where some of us are not, they use our voices to inform the strategies and the actions that they suggest. So that's another way. So if you consider yourself an ally, I ask you, don't raise your hand, but look at yourself along the spectrum in terms of, yes, you believe in equity, but are you willing to take a risk on behalf of the other people who we've been talking about? Women, Black women. And by the way, all women are created equally, but we know not all women are treated equally. And I think it's important, again, that we don't sweep certain things under the rug because we can try to address women as a whole group, but we have very different experiences historically and right now. So I think it's important that we not lose that focus. David, that was a long answer to your question.
I think it could have been longer, but yeah, it resonates in so many different ways. And I do think about the idea of majority groups around allyship coming together and often thinking they're going to fix something for somebody else, and which is not the right approach. And this is about coming alongside and being co-conspirators. And in the true spirit, to me, the true spirit of allyship is in being a co-conspirator and doing that. There was a male allyship group that we had worked with at one point, and their slogan was "Nothing about us without us." And this was about, again, making sure that there were no decisions that were related to women, in this case, around gender, that were being made without women in the room, and were part of making that decision. And I think that's such a critical part of that. So much of this conversation, though, and Tina, I heard this in your, in your response too, was around kind of valuing. We're really working in, I don't know, to some extent, focusing really on individual goodwill here in a lot of different ways. And as we know, that's great. It starts, with you, starts with me and one individual person, but how do we begin to hold organizations accountable for this and get to institutional levels of equity in the organization? What matters in terms of how do we move from that individual to the institutional part of creating this across the organization?
Yes, and not to plug my work, but Shared Sisterhood, we talk about this explicitly because, well, let me just get to a quick answer is how are you evaluating your organizational leaders? Someone else on the panel mentioned this in terms of your evaluations, in terms of the basis of promotion, in terms of the basis of pay raises. But before we can even get to that institutional level, and here's where Shared Sisterhood comes in, I think in order to hold organizations accountable, we have to begin to hold individuals accountable and helping them see what are their attitudes towards the groups that they're trying to help. What are your perceptions of women, of Black people, of Black women, of gay people, of immigrants? Where did those perceptions come from? How are those perceptions embedded into the norms of professionalism, things that we just consider to be, quote, normal, but are actually derived from stereotypes and cultural interpretations of what is and is not professional? Once the individual has sort of that's called dig, once they've done that introspective work, then it's important for them to bridge with people who are different than them, centering the value of equity. And the reason why that is so critical in terms of moving organizations forward is that, as you've heard from other panelists, oftentimes the work that we're talking about is done in a part. People are influencing the way that we perceive the workplace in those interpersonal relationships. And so then once you have someone who has done the dig work, who has bridged with people to really understand, who are different than them, to really understand some of the unique challenges that may be confronting other groups. Now we can look and say, okay, what are the people processes that we have in place? And I've talked, there's how you recruit, how you socialize, how you promote people, how you train people, who gets recommended for promotion, et cetera, et cetera. It is very challenging for individuals to look at those data if they have not, and to move the organization forward, if they have not really spent time understanding where their own attitudes come from. Because as human beings, we can rationalize most behavior, as in particular bad behavior. We will figure out a way to frame it so that we are not held to account. But if we want to hold each other accountable and hold organizations accountable, I think it is important to start at the individual level, build up to interpersonal and then institutional. And then, David, some of the examples that I've talked about, when you look at what are your evaluation systems, how does your pay equity look? And I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily have to release that to everyone, but I do think that it's absolutely critical that key decision makers in HR, in the C-suite, know what those data look like and begin to actually say, how are we going to, or are we going to communicate this to necessary individuals, to middle managers, so that we can begin to rectify that? So those are some specific steps at each of the levels of analysis that can help us hold organizations accountable.
I hear a lot of transparency in there, and you're scaring all the HR folks and legal folks. And I mean, we should just start talking about, all right, so how much do you make, Tina? And we can role model it right here, right now, right?
Yeah,
We'll have our
that's
pay
not
transparency party.
Yeah, that's not what I'm suggesting. I will tell you that in some organizations, I have asked other people things about course releases. I'm a professor, course releases and pay. And in some institutions that may be, I don't know, is that considered illegal or violating procedure? So just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that individual employees compare salaries, because I know that would make all HR people faint. But there's a reason why HR doesn't want you to discuss that. And I think the bigger question of HR is, why is that a problem? Is it because you know that we're paying people differently? And they might not so you might say, well, it's because different people are bringing different things to the table. But there's a reason why, I believe it's in Massachusetts, people are no longer allowed to ask, employers are no longer allowed to ask, what was your salary at the prior institution? Because that is how you embed pay inequity. So I've been underpaid at another organization, and now I have to bring that here. So I really would sort of turn the mirror around and ask HR professionals to say, this is dig work. Why are we so uncomfortable about employees discussing their salary? If in fact we were paying people equitably and we had logic and rationale and we're transparent about that, why would we care?
If you want to read more, read Shared Sisterhood. I highly recommend it. And get into your dig. We all need to. We only have a few minutes here. I want to do one quick kind of rapid fire question, but as a reminder, we're going to go into a table discussion still. So the questions are on your table, not to look at them yet, but we are going to go into about 15 minutes, and you'll get a chance to talk about these same issues amongst your group at your table, get to know each other and your experiences as well, and learn from each other. But for my panelists, one last question, and just take about a minute or so to respond, and we'll just we'll go down the line here. So yeah, Crystal, there you're back on. So I was looking for, and we talked about this during the prep call, about a particular relationship at work, or in some cases it might be just a practice that you have within your team or in your company that really impacted you in a positive way towards the way you approach and way you see equity and belonging in the workplace.
Yes, I would have to say that is probably in the environment I'm in now and with my current boss. So my research focuses on the double bind. How do women balance being warm and being competent, and how these peer relationships really matter and can strengthen our productivity at work. But a lot of times that also means that we have to conform to these definitions of leadership that don't quite fit us. And this changes based off context. I just talked about the double bind, but let's consider those who are neurotypical, who are expected to track all these social norms that we tend to take for granted. So being able to come to work and experience a form of belonging really allows you to take away all that stress and take away that energy that you would be placing elsewhere outside of your work. So I think my boss, she doesn't just spout out the research and recognize it, she puts it into practice. So that is what I think organizations can take first, is that it starts from within, and these relationships matter that we're building in our organizations.
Thank you. Olivia.
Yes. I hope that this story also like resonates with everything that's been said, because I especially resonate with what Tina said about taking on risks and allies, like taking on burdens for others and really putting a mirror. And I know my experience, so much of this has always been the case of putting the emphasis on the person, like on the woman, and saying, or like on the one Black person in the organization, and saying, if they don't want you, you don't want to be there, and it's up to you to like find a fit that is good for you. When I talk about a relationship that was really important to me, it was my PhD advisor, Dr. Taylor Phillips. And I remember when I was going on the academic job market, I asked her, like, do you have anything that you want for me? And she was, whatever you want for you, like, that's what I want. And I pushed her on it, like, really, what do you want for me? And she said, I don't want the field to miss out on you. I would like you to stay in academia because I don't want the field to miss out on you. And not only did that mean a lot, but also really taking it and saying, if you leave, that's what's best for you, do what's best for you. But it's going to be worse for the world overall if you do. And that's really and that's how I think about moving forward for my PhD students in here. Like, that applies to you too. For all of you here, like, just imagine if you are doing what you are doing, it is better for the world for you to be doing that. And it is worse off if you weren't doing that. I think that was really important for me.
Thank you. Jessica.
So, not surprisingly, I think about this question through the lens of my research as well. And there are two people that come to mind, but both for the same reason. One is also was my advisor back in 2005 when I was getting my PhD. And another was someone who actually worked here at Rutgers Business School, who became a very close friend. Both are men, which I actually think plays a role in how I felt about the behaviors that they were engaging in. But in our research, many of us are familiar with the idea of silos and people who are considered boundary spanners. In the networks research, we call them brokers. So these are people who fall between two disconnected groups. And those people can play different roles when they fall into that position. They can be gatekeepers. So they could purposefully keep those two different groups and the members of those two different groups apart. And they can leverage a lot of the power and the information among those two groups for themselves, right? And what I found for both of these people were that they weren't gatekeepers, they were liaisons, they were supporters, they were people who helped not only continue the flow of information between those groups, but introduce me to others who were in those disconnected groups. And that behavior in and of itself, not only introducing me, but being developmental in the way that they did that. So acknowledging the work that I was doing, lifting me up, saying that my work was going to be relevant to what other people were interested in, and then stepping away. And so not monitoring those behaviors, not continuing to be involved, but allowing me to flourish in those new relationships. And so I find that type of brokerage behavior, the liaison type of brokerage behavior, the developmental behavior, especially from people who we might assume have a little bit more or have more tenure in their positions, or who have a little more privilege than we might feel like we do. Those behaviors, I think, were incredibly meaningful and also modeled to me the type of advisor that I wanted to be and the types of behaviors that I wanted to continue to pursue and engage in for my students as well. So those were the most impactful relationships for me.
Be a broker. Got it. And bring us home, Tina.
Thank you so much. So I would say, so I sort of have a base of people. These are people who proactively reach out to me whenever I join a new organization. And those people often happen to be Black women. They want to make sure that I'm successful. There have been other Afro-Latinas, some Asian women, but it's been very interesting to me that those have typically not been white women. And I'm not trying to shade anyone, but I do think it's important for us to understand that we've been socialized differently. So, a book that I always recommend that has really informed the way that I think about life and shared sisterhood is, again, Stella and Como and Ella Bell, Our Separate Ways, where it talks about the socialization along race in the workplace. So, those are the people who've reached out to me, and that is a base of support that I have had in every single space that I've occupied. The second are the people who I've proactively reached out to, who then, in fact, or who have reached out to me. And so Beth Livingston, she's a white woman. We co-wrote the book together. Beth and I are deep. We are tight. We talk about money. We talk about love. We talk about work. I trust her. She trusts me. We are vulnerable. We take risks on behalf of each other. And then I'd actually say I have had some really important relationships with very, very strong, rich white men, which has been interesting to me. And in the workplace, where they have sort of taken me under their wing and sort of opened the door for me to get into spaces that I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. And that has been really surprising and phenomenal. And I want to do some research in terms of what might be undergirding that, but it's been a real pleasure. So that's a long answer to the question, but I think there's a base of support. Then there are people who I've reached out to, and then there are these people who have sort of taken me under their wing.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists. Now we're going to transition right to our table conversations, and you're going to get to answer that same question that our panelists just did, as well as a second question that really thinks about how do you, as you hear these different examples about what was really impactful for you, how can you use that, right, to create change within your own organization to help your workplaces foster that same kind of connection? So what would help you to enable that within your organization? What one change? So those questions are on up there on the screen, as well as on your table, should be on one of the sheets there. And we've got till 10:15, 10 minutes to have that conversation.